Thank you for joining us for the second episode of our series on real estate mogul and accused murderer Robert Durst. If you haven't seen the first episode yet, I would obviously recommend you start there so you can get caught up to where we're at. A link will be available in the description and the upper right hand corner. With that out of the way, let's get into the video. On Christmas Eve 2000, a neighbor of Susan Berman's noticed her dogs had been running around the yard unattended for several hours. Upon closer examination, they also saw that the back door to her rundown home on Benedict Canyon Road was open. Alarmed by this, they placed a call to 911, who quickly arrived on scene. Inside of the home, police discovered Susan Berman lying dead on the hardwood floor in a back bedroom. She had been shot in the back of her head. There was nothing missing from the home, which admittedly had very little worth taking outside of the computer in her small makeshift office she'd set up for herself in the living room. There was also no sign of forced entry, which ruled out robbery and indicated to police whoever killed her had been someone she was acquainted with. The timing of this was obviously very suspicious. The investigation into Robert Durst had been reopened barely 2 months prior, and the New York District Attorney's Office was leaning heavily on Miss Berman for information. Whether or not she had plans on speaking with them seems to be up in the air. Jeanine Pirro, the New York District Attorney who was leading the reopened investigation into Kathy's disappearance, claims that she was scheduled to speak with Miss Berman just after the holidays. Some of Kathy's friends and family have disputed this though, saying that the New York DA's office was dragging their feet at this point, and that Miss Pirro was, in their minds, less interested in finding out what happened to Kathy and more interested in the attention she was getting from the press every time she talked about the case. Regardless of who you believe, it's hard not to look at how soon Susan was murdered after the new investigation was announced and wonder if there was some correlation. However, the Beverly Hills Police Department initially began looking in a completely different direction. Susan's loose connection to organized crime through her father was very well known. She'd always been quite open about it and had literally made a career out of writing on the topic. The nature of her murder was also eerily reminiscent of a mafia-style execution, with a single shot right through the back of Miss Berman's head. Given this, police wondered if perhaps Susan had begun writing about something that certain people didn't want to be public knowledge. She had apparently told friends of hers in the weeks leading up to her death that she had information that was going to, quote, blow the top off of things. Had Miss Berman allowed her love affair with organized crime to go a step too far? Had her ever-curious nature finally gotten her into a dangerous situation resulting in her death? At first, police believed that could be the case, though just a few days into the investigation, this theory would be dismissed. A couple of days after her body was discovered, the Beverly Hills Police Department received an anonymous letter in the mail, written in plain block letters with the word Beverly misspelled, something that will become very important later on. Inside was a white piece of paper that had Miss Berman's address written on it, and the word cadaver written underneath. The postmark made it clear that the letter had been sent before news of Susan Berman's death broke, and this was understandably odd. There weren't many murders in the department's history where the killer sent a letter to police telling them where to find the body. This indicated to them that the person who killed her was likely someone who cared about her enough they didn't want her to just lie there and decompose. No fingerprints or saliva was found on the letter, but the fact it had been sent pretty much ruled out any organized crime connection. Mobsters aren't exactly known for their sense of compassion, and often go out of their way to make sure a victim's body is never found, much less send a letter to police telling them exactly where it is. Now, as I said in the last episode, Susan and Robert still had a good relationship according to her friends, despite the fact that Miss Berman had borrowed a considerable amount of money from him in the last couple years of her life. However, there is a strong possibility that may have privately changed. Her friends admitted that Susan was a different person when she was in dire straits, and it didn't get any more dire than her situation in the late 90s. Susan was living in a home with almost no furniture, no heating or air, and barely able to muster enough money together to pay her rent each month. She had been working hard to find a way out of this, but time after time, every glimmer of hope she had seemed to fall through. Even those closest to her agreed that in a time of this much peril, Susan wasn't above something like blackmail. Was it possible that she had attempted to extort money from her close friend Robert, under the threat that she would go to police and tell them what she knew about Kathy if he didn't hand it over? Officers in New York and Beverly Hills certainly thought it was a possibility. In the immediate aftermath of her killing, police did take a look into Robert's activities and found a very interesting set of coincidences leading up to the murder. For starters, Mr. Durst had remarried just a few days after hearing that the investigation into his first wife's disappearance had been reopened. This time it was to a woman named Deborah Lee Sheraton. The two had an on-again, off-again relationship for over a decade, and had an apartment together in New York City that they would occasionally stay at. Miss Sheraton had been a confidant of Robert, and the two were extremely close. However, throughout the entirety of their relationship, they had never talked about getting married. So when Robert proposed to her just days after the new investigation into Kathy was announced, it understandably raised some eyebrows. By marrying Robert, Deborah was now under husband and wife privilege, meaning legally she couldn't be compelled to testify against him, and any information she may have learned about Kathy would be safe from investigators. Mr. Durst also signed a power of attorney over to her a couple of years later, giving Deborah control of his finances in the event Robert found himself medically incapacitated or in legal troubles. Secondly, it was discovered that Robert had flown out to the city of Trinidad, California just prior to Susan's death. Trinidad is a rural coastal city in Northern California that is about a 10-hour drive from Beverly Hills. Mr. Durst was recorded leaving Trinidad on December 19th, when he picked up his car from the long-term parking in a nearby airport. Mysteriously, his cell phone was turned off after this, and no record of his actions are available until December 23rd, when he bought a plane ticket in San Francisco and flew home to New York, just one day before Susan's body was found. This is all obviously a very odd set of coincidences, but as far as evidence goes, it's all circumstantial, which, as we know, is not enough to warrant placing someone under arrest, much less securing a conviction. Robert would call and speak with Susan's friends and family in the days following her murder, but soon disappeared out of most of their lives, choosing not to even attend Miss Berman's funeral. This obviously rubbed a lot of them the wrong way, and in many of their eyes darkened the cloud of suspicion that hung over Mr. Durst's head. However, not everyone believed Robert was responsible for Susan's death. Sarah Kaufman met Susan Berman when she briefly dated his father during the late 1980s. Not long after her husband passed away from a heroin overdose. The relationship eventually ended, but Sarah and his sister developed a very close bond with Susan, and ended up viewing her as something of an adopted mother. After her and their father broke up, they maintained this relationship, even asking if they could live with her instead of their own dad. Sarah stayed close with Miss Berman into his adult life, and had spoken to her just days before she was killed. He'd also got to know Robert Durst very well, and thought quite highly of him. So much so, in fact, that he completely scoffed at the notion Mr. Durst would have hurt Susan. According to him, Robert and her were as close of friends as two people could possibly be. He said Mr. Durst never showed any resentment towards Susan for the money she had borrowed, and in fact would often contact her to see if she needed further financial assistance. This help extended to Sarah, who Robert kept a close relationship with after Susan was killed. even giving him money to pay for his college tuition. During his interview with HBO for the series The Jinx, he flatly stated that the thought of Robert killing Miss Berman never once entered his mind. However, a very interesting set of events would take place during the filming of the documentary that would severely impact Sarab's unshakable loyalty to Mr. Durst, something we'll get back to a bit later on in this video. Despite a tireless investigation by the Beverly Hills Police Department, Susan Berman's murder quickly turned cold. They definitely had their suspicions regarding Robert Durst, but were never able to muster up enough evidence to indict him over it, for now at least. After returning home to New York, Mr. Durst, who was under heavy scrutiny by the press and police at the time, packed his things up and left town. He would spend the next year traveling across the country, staying in various different cities, and doing the best he could to avoid the public spotlight, which worked for a time. Soon, though, he would re-emerge far away from the bright lights of New York or the sunny coasts of California, opening a gruesome new chapter in this ever-winding story. On September 30th, 2001, police in Galveston, Texas received a phone call from the parents of a child who claimed to have made a horrific discovery in the waters off Channelview Drive. The boy claimed that while walking down the street of the upper middle class neighborhood, he saw what appeared to be a man's torso floating in the waters near him. Police responded to the scene, and it didn't take long for them to discover this was no childish prank. Washed up along the shore by one of the several piers that lined Channelview was a headless, armless torso of an elderly Caucasian male. Police looked around in the water and quickly discovered several black trash bags floating around where the torso had been found. Pulling them out and examining them, they discovered these bags contained severed arms and legs, with the entire body of the victim except for his head eventually being found within them. Police divers put forth an exhaustive effort over the following weeks to try and find the victim's head, but unfortunately were not successful. After lifting fingerprints off of one of the hands, police identified the remains as belonging to 71-year-old Morris Black, a man who lived in an apartment building off of Avenue K. Police went to this property, which was located in a, let's call it, lower class section of town, and discovered it was owned by a man named Klaus Dillman. He described Mr. Black as an eccentric man who was a bit of a curmudgeon, and really didn't seem to have many friends. He was also not the greatest occupant, according to his landlord. He would often be late on rent and would regularly pick fights with Klaus over things like the electric and gas bill. Now, you might be thinking, well, that's understandable. I hate when my electric bill is too high. But Morris took this to a whole new level. A search into his background revealed a conviction in 1997 for making terroristic threats when he called his electric company and threatened to bomb their headquarters because his utility bill was $16 higher than it should have been. He also often got into arguments with people who lived in the buildings along Avenue K. In one incident, he even supposedly went over to a neighbor who was smoking a cigarette on their porch and yelled at him to put it out. Yes, he walked out of his yard and told someone smoking a cigarette on their own porch to stop. Now, Mr. Black might not have had many friends, but he didn't have known enemies either. And grouchy elderly men who are a little bit crazy are fairly common. Frankly, I think every neighborhood on planet Earth probably has someone like that. What could have possibly motivated someone to murder and dismember the 71-year-old, though, was entirely unknown. Police knew immediately they had their work cut out for them, but at the time they couldn't have possibly imagined just how insane this case would get. Across the hall from Morris lived a middle-aged mute woman with dark hair by the name of Dorothy Siner, who, unlike Mr. Black, was basically as perfect a renter as one could ask for. She never bothered her landlord for anything and was always on time with her rent, even offering to pay a full year up front upon first moving into the apartment. Police understandably wanted to talk to Dorothy since she lived across from the victim and possibly get any information from her they could. There was just one problem. Dorothy was nowhere to be found. According to Klaus, Miss Siner was often away from the apartment traveling, and it wasn't uncommon for her to be gone weeks at a time. Furthermore, he indicated to police that while Dorothy would go off on her trips, her brother-in-law would often come by to take care of the apartment for her, even staying the night on some occasions. Mr. Dillman had never spoken to him personally or seen him up close, but described him as roughly the same height and build as Dorothy, which led investigators to a bizarre theory. These apartments weren't exactly what you would call high-quality living. They were quaint little dwellings that were designed for people living on a budget. If someone had the money to not only travel all the time, but also could pay for a year's worth of rent up front, it is very unlikely they would choose to live somewhere like 2213 Avenue K. Could it be that the mute middle-aged Miss Siner was actually a mister, and that the supposed brother-in-law who would come into the apartment while she was on vacation was actually the real Dorothy Siner? Galveston is a small town and relatively off the beaten path. A perfect place for someone to hide out if they wanted to get away from something or someone. This theory gained even more traction when an upstairs neighbor said the night before Morris's body was discovered, she witnessed a man who resembled Miss Siner's brother-in-law loading several trash bags into a silver Honda behind the apartment building. Searching the lobby area of the home, police uncovered a blood trail that went from Mr. Black's apartment door all the way down to the sidewalk. They went inside his apartment and discovered it had recently been cleaned top to bottom. On the kitchen floor, they observed drop cloths, which when moved to the side, revealed scratches in the flooring, possibly made by a saw or some other type of cutting instrument. They peeled back the laminate and found several large bloodstains underneath. The blood from the apartment hallway was analyzed and traced back to Mr. Black, making it abundantly clear his body was dismembered in the apartment, then taken out through the front hallway door and down the sidewalk to the back of the building. Searching the trash cans out back of the apartment, police found a .22 caliber pistol alongside a receipt for a local hardware store with a disturbing laundry list of purchases that included a bow saw, a paring knife, and drop cloths. They also stumbled upon an appointment receipt for a local eye clinic, and shockingly, the name of the patient on it wasn't Dorothy Siner, Morris Black, Klaus Dillman, or the upstairs neighbor. The name on the ticket was Robert Durst. At this point in our story, detectives in Galveston, Texas had no idea who Robert Durst was, but it wouldn't be long before they would find out. They took the ticket to the eye clinic and spoke with the person working at the front desk, who indicated that Mr. Durst was supposed to come in and pick the glasses up at the end of the week. Understandably, police didn't think he was going to show up, but left their pager numbers anyway just in case. Shockingly, when Friday rolled around, the detectives were stunned when their pagers beeped with the number from the eye clinic. They quickly made their way over there, just to arrive right after Robert had left. But it didn't take long for a patrol car to catch up to him just a couple of blocks away from the store. Searching his vehicle, which was a silver Honda, they found a handgun in his glove box and a bow saw in his trunk that was the same brand as the one on the receipt for the hardware store. Police arrested Mr. Durst and charged him with murder in the death of Morris Black. Mr. Dillman confirmed officers' suspicions that Miss Siner was in fact Robert Durst, who had apparently been dressing up as a woman and living under a false identity in order to hide from the prying eyes of the New York District Attorney's Office. The upstairs neighbor identified Mr. Durst as the man she'd seen loading trash bags into the vehicle that night. The pistol found in the garbage can out back of the apartment building was traced back to him, and blood on the bow saw was eventually found and matched to Morris Black. In short, police believed they had Robert Durst basically caught red-handed. All that was left now was for prosecutors to wrap up what would likely be an easy conviction, or so they thought. Robert was held on a $250,000 bail, which he was quickly able to pay after one phone call to his wife Deborah in New York City. Less than 24 hours after his arrest, Durst was out on bail, and giving him bail at all would prove to be a fatal mistake on the part of the Galveston legal system. A few weeks later, on October 16th, he was due in court for his arraignment. A standard hearing that almost everyone, especially people with $250,000 on the line, shows up to. Robert Durst, however, is not most people, and he took this opportunity to pack his things and go on the run. What followed over the next month was a cross-country search for Robert that saw him pop up in several different areas. Most eerily, the person who had purchased his and Kathy's old home in South Salem reported to police she walked outside one day and saw Robert in her backyard staring blankly out into the lake next to her property. When she confronted him, he ran back to his car and pulled off. Given his wealth and travel experience, it stood to reason that he could show up anywhere in the United States, which meant for police tracking him down was likely going to be a slow and arduous process. But the ever unpredictable Robert Durst would surprise investigators yet again. On November 30th, 2001, Robert entered a Wegmans grocery store in Luzerne County, Pennsylvania, and was caught by security shoplifting some Band-Aids and a sandwich. You might imagine he did this because he was desperate and running low on funds, but when police searched his vehicle, they found over $13,000 in cash, which included almost $600 that was literally in Durst's pocket when he was caught stealing. When asked about this later during his interviews with HBO, he said, quote, "I just wanted to do it," which is exactly the kind of answer you should be expecting from Robert Durst by this point in our story. His appearance was dramatically different than it was at the time of his initial arrest in Galveston, having shaved all of his hair off of his head, including his eyebrows. Further searches of the vehicle uncovered some marijuana and a handgun. Robert was charged with possession of a firearm as well as shoplifting, but was soon extradited back to Texas to face the much more serious charge of murdering and dismembering Morris Black. And this time he was understandably held without bail. At this point in time, Mr. Durst was represented by the family attorney Michael Kennedy, which made for a very awkward situation. As we discussed in the last episode, Robert was in the midst of a very bitter legal battle with his family's business over his portion of the fortune. He had left the business officially by now, but was still receiving a payout of $2 million per year from the family trust. As far as him and his brother were concerned, their relationship had degraded so badly by now that at some point Doug hired a bodyguard for him and his family, specifically to protect them from the potential danger he believed Robert posed. Robert's wife Deborah, who was fiercely loyal to her husband, was adamantly against Mr. Kennedy leading Robert's defense team. She believed that their end goal with the trial would be to paint Durst as mentally unfit, which would have voided the power of attorney he had signed over to her, as well as potentially their marriage license. This would also give the Durst organization and Douglas a very solid legal foundation to argue that Robert couldn't be trusted to manage his own finances, which would put control of his money in the hands of his brother and effectively destroy any chance he had at reclaiming some of the family fortune. Mr. Kennedy insisted that this was not his goal, and that as Robert's lawyer, his primary objective was to do everything in his power to get Mr. Durst acquitted. He brought in high-powered Houston defense attorney Dick DeGarian to assist with Robert's defense, but this did little to soothe Deborah's faith in their motivations. She wanted to hire a lawyer by the name of Michael Ramsey, who had represented former Enron chairman Kenneth Lay, and she wanted both DeGarian and Kennedy gone. Eventually, an agreement was made. Michael Kennedy stepped down, but Dick DeGarian stayed on, and Michael Ramsey was brought in alongside him, with a third attorney by the name of Chip Lewis also being hired. The combined price tag of this platinum-tier legal team was a staggering $1.8 million, but they would prove to be worth every penny. For the next year, Robert Durst sat in a jail cell in Galveston, Texas, awaiting the start of his trial for the murder of Morris Black. And to say the Galveston District Attorney's Office was confident of their odds of success would be a dramatic understatement. To them, this case was as much of a slam dunk as it got. Mr. Durst had been spotted by an eyewitness loading garbage bags into his car, and a bow saw with Morris Black's blood on it was found in the very same car. There was no way that Robert could deny he had dismembered Morris Black's body, and no amount of money poured into the Avengers of legal teams was going to change that. This extreme overconfidence caused them to take a very laissez-faire approach to the pretrial proceedings. They didn't hold a mock trial, which is very common in high-profile cases, as it allows the prosecution to prepare themselves for any potential curveballs a defense might throw at them. They didn't really take the time to prepare their questions for witnesses, and in what would arguably prove to be their most costly mistake, they didn't really bother vetting the jury as thoroughly as one would expect. Again, as far as they saw it, the people on the jury really didn't matter because it was so obvious Mr. Durst had killed Morris Black that they would be able to prove their case regardless of who the 12 people sitting on the jury booth happened to be. When the trial began in early 2003, the defense immediately came out with their opening statement and threw a curveball. Robert Durst was claiming self-defense. According to them, a friendship had blossomed between Mr. Durst and Mr. Black while Robert was living at the apartment on Avenue K. One day when Robert was visiting his good buddy across the hall, Morris suddenly snapped and pulled a gun on him. The two began struggling, and in the resulting melee, the gun fired, killing Mr. Black. Terrified that he would be arrested for murder, Robert decided that his best course of action would be to dismember the 71-year-old, dispose of his remains, and hope no one would find him. Prosecutors were completely blindsided by this argument, which took full advantage of the robust self-defense laws in Texas. See, in most other states, when someone wants to claim self-defense, the burden is on them to prove that they were in fact acting in self-defense. But in Texas, a very conservative state with an extremely vigorous belief in the right to defend yourself, it's the opposite. There, the burden is on the state to prove that your self-defense claim is false, and until they are able to prove that you weren't, the jury is supposed to operate under the assumption that you were. This suddenly put Galveston County prosecutors in a precarious situation. Morris Black's head, which was believed to be where he had been shot, was never recovered, and without that, refuting Robert's self-defense claim would be a challenge that they were woefully underprepared for. Mr. Durst's defense team wasted no time weaving their intricate tale. Robert was a lonely, socially awkward stoner who was driven out of New York City by an ambitious and overzealous prosecutor, determined to make her career blaming him for the tragic disappearance of his beloved wife, Kathy. They brought a psychiatrist in as a witness who argued that Mr. Durst displayed symptoms of Asperger's syndrome, which explained his erratic behavior and inability to have normal social interactions. Additionally, they painted Morris Black as a monster who was loved by no one and terrorized the neighborhood he lived in. Robert was then put on the witness stand to give his version of events, where he carefully described what happened and his thought process behind why he decided to dismember his supposed friend. Mr. Durst was very careful to describe things in a manner that he was told to do so by his defense. And years later, in talking with HBO, would stop just short of saying he committed perjury, but did confess that per his lawyer's instructions, he omitted details about the case that would make him less sympathetic in the eyes of the jury, and sympathetic is exactly how they viewed him. The jury seemed enthralled by Durst, even laughing multiple times at jokes or comments he made on the witness stand. And needless to say, when the jury is laughing with a guy who has already confessed to dismembering another human being, that doesn't exactly bode well for the prosecution. And here is where I think I need to finally mention a very disturbing truth about Robert Durst. Something I've been kind of dancing around up to this point, but needs to finally be acknowledged. Mr. Durst does possess a strange sort of charisma. His awkwardness makes him come across as a very blunt, straight-shooting kind of person, who can't help but tell it like it is because he doesn't have the time for subtleties that normal social interactions possess. It makes him awkward and a little uncomfortable, but strangely likable. And I think it helps explain a lot of the questions around this story, like, why did the NYPD just take his story at face value for so long when Kathy went missing? Why was Sarah Kaufman so certain Robert wasn't responsible for the murder of someone he viewed as his mother, when there was more than enough reason to be suspicious of him? And how could a jury just sit there and laugh along with a man who had confessed to dismembering his elderly neighbor? This sort of charisma and ability to get people to like you can be very, very dangerous in the hands of someone with evil intentions. Galveston prosecutors were as horrendously underprepared for this as they could possibly be. They made little effort to push back on the witnesses brought forward by the defense, and even their cross-examination of Robert Durst went very poorly. Their entire strategy focused on the common sense understanding that you don't dismember a body when you've acted in self-defense, which, while undeniably compelling, will only get you so far, especially against a talented team of attorneys who understands the law of the state they are in and is taking full advantage of it. In November 2003, the jury broke for deliberation, and after 26 hours returned with their verdict, which, as you've probably guessed by now given the tone of this entire section, was not guilty. Robert, and frankly the entire country, was stunned. How could the jury have been this stupid? How could they have fallen for such a silly defense claim? Their decision was mocked endlessly by everyone from Jon Stewart to Saturday Night Live. But I think placing the blame on the jury's collective lack of intelligence would be letting Galveston prosecutors off the hook for the abysmally poor job they did. I could go on a long rant making fun of them, but I think this quote from Judge Susan Criss, who presided over the trial, sums it up better than I ever could. In an interview years later with the website Mashable, she was asked how the jury could have possibly come to this conclusion when his guilt was so obvious to everyone else. Her response was, quote, "I could see early on that there was a danger that the state was going to lose. The state walked in not prepared, and they didn't think they had to be. They did not think about what to ask each witness, including him, and questions to ask jurors, or to pick the best jurors for their case. The defense had 2 mock trials they had gone through. You could tell when the state were asking Durst questions, they were doing it off the cuff. They spent 3 days cross-examining him, taking turns because both lawyers had the flu. They forgot to ask him, where did you put the head? The head was never recovered. You had to have the bullet wound. There was no bullet wound on the rest of the body, and that was the cause of death, a shot to the back of the head. They also didn't challenge anything the defense said. There was evidence we had during pre-trial hearings that they did not try to introduce. Tape-recorded phone conversations from jail in which he said things that were incriminating that showed an inclination to lie at trial. I think at some point the state realized, oh my gosh, things aren't going as we expected, and they gave up and wanted it to be done, and they were intimidated by the defense lawyers. It sort of looked to me like they were throwing in the towel. When the judge who was overseeing the trial publicly states in an interview that it looked like you were throwing in the towel, that doesn't speak very highly to your skills as a prosecutor. That isn't to say the jury doesn't deserve its share of criticism. One particular juror who has drawn the ire of many who followed the case is a man named Chris Lavelle. Mr. Lavelle seemed to fall under Durst's spell almost immediately, and during deliberations was basically a cheerleader for the defense, aggressively arguing in favor of acquitting Durst even when a handful of other jurors were unsure. Following the trial, Chris developed an oddly chummy relationship with Robert, visiting him 5 times in jail after the trial's conclusion, and maintaining his friendship with him in the years since. To this day, he strongly maintains his belief that Robert is innocent of everything he's ever been accused of, going so far as to tell HBO he's, quote, the most unfairly persecuted man I've ever met. While many to this day argue that the jury and the prosecution failed at their jobs, one group of people who certainly did not were the Galveston Police Department. I know in part 1 I was very critical of the NYPD and the lack of effort they put into investigating Kathy's disappearance. I'm looking at you, Michael. And for the sake of fairness, I think it's important to give credit where credit is due. Detectives with the Galveston Police did a phenomenal job and conducted a very thorough and professional investigation. It's just a shame for them that the prosecution didn't feel the need to put forth the same effort. And you can tell watching them in interviews, this loss still haunts them to this very day, even though I don't think anyone would argue it was their fault. Ultimately, though, the person who got the worst deal out of this was Morris Black. I'm not here to argue Morris was a perfect human being. I think it goes without saying that no one is, and he obviously had some very bad anger issues. But this is a man who was likely very lonely. He had no friends or family, and when he died he was all but forgotten, while his killer got to sit on a witness stand and crack jokes with the jury. His life was just as important as anyone else's, and the fact that after 71 years on this earth, he met his end by being chopped up and tossed into a cold, empty bay is frankly just sad. I can't help but look at this story and feel incredibly sorry for a person whose life was taken from him in such a brutal way and never got the justice he desperately deserved. A year later, in December 2004, Robert Durst would plead guilty to evidence tampering for the dismemberment of Mr. Black's body and received a 5-year prison sentence for which he was credited with time served. In July of 2005, he was released on parole and was essentially a free man, with the stipulation that he stay at his home in Houston, Texas, and would contact his parole officer for permission to travel. Of course, this is Robert Durst we're talking about, and things didn't go that simply. In December of that year, he took an unauthorized trip to Galveston, Texas, where he visited his former apartment building as well as nearby Galveston Mall. His cover was blown when at the mall he was spotted by, and you're not going to believe this, the judge who presided over his murder trial 2 years earlier. Mr. Durst was returned to jail soon after and served the remainder of his sentence, being released again in July of 2006. For the next few years, he lived what would be described as a relatively normal life, especially by his standards. He reached a settlement with the Durst organization shortly shortly after his release, where he agreed to give up all interest in the Durst family trust in exchange for a one-time settlement of $65 million. He used this money to buy several properties around Manhattan and continued to enjoy a high-class lifestyle alongside his wife Deborah. Jeanine Pirro had left the New York District Attorney's office by the time of Robert's release and was focused on her political ambitions, which eventually failed, leading her to become an author and later a commentator for the Fox News channel, a position she holds to this very day. But even with his arch nemesis now off to greener pastures, the state of New York continued its search for clues in the disappearance of Kathy Durst. Likewise, the Beverly Hills Police Department also continued trying to build a case against him for the murder of Susan Berman. They were now convinced that Robert had killed Susan in order to prevent her from telling police the information she had regarding Kathy's disappearance, but were still unable to prove their case at this point. And for most stories, this would likely be the end. Robert Durst had evaded the grasp of justice twice, and many people in that position would just lay low, content to live out the remaining years they had quietly without drawing any attention to themselves. But as we've learned many times over the course of these two episodes, Robert Durst is not most people. Enter Andrew Jarecki, a filmmaker whose most notable work at the time was the HBO true crime documentary Capturing the Freemans, which released in 2003. He'd been following Robert Durst's story for several years and found himself absolutely enthralled by the case. As a result, he wrote a screenplay for a film that featured a fictionalized version of Durst's life. He eventually found a production company for it, and the movie released in 2010 under the title All Good Things. Despite the star-studded cast who gave what was widely considered fantastic performances, the film was a critical flop and did even worse at the box office, making back just $650,000 against a budget of $60 million. Had that been the end of it, this film would likely have faded into obscurity and been forgotten, piled atop the mountains of other ambitious dramas that tried but ultimately failed to find an audience. That wasn't the end of the story though, because one very important person who did like the film was Robert Durst. In fact, like is putting it mildly. Robert absolutely loved this movie. Having kept a relatively low profile in the years since his acquittal, Mr. Durst saw something in Andrew Jarecki's film, a chance to publicly tell his story for the first time on his terms. He contacted Andrew and expressed his admiration for the movie. Andrew suggested the possibility of an interview with Robert to add as a bonus feature on the DVD copy of All Good Things. Mr. Durst loved this idea so much, he took it a step further and offered to do a full-on commentary of the film alongside Andrew. And I'm not joking here. If you go pick up the DVD of All Good Things, you will find a full-on director's commentary featuring Robert Durst. Mr. Durst had so much fun doing this that when it was over, he asked Andrew if they could do more interviews together. The filmmaker, of course, readily agreed, and over the course of the next several years, he and Robert sat down for hours upon hours of one-on-one interviews. This would eventually lead to what is arguably one of the most impactful true crime documentary series ever made, HBO's The Jinx. In this series, Andrew and his team thoroughly dissect the life of Robert Durst, from his childhood through his marriage with Kathy and the events surrounding her disappearance, to the murder of Susan Berman and Robert going on trial for the killing of Morris Black. If you consider yourself a true crime enthusiast and have not seen this miniseries, I cannot stress to you how important it is you do so. While I don't believe it is without flaws, this series represents, in my opinion, everything this genre strives to be. With that being said, if you don't want any major spoilers, I highly suggest you click off this video now, because from here on we will be discussing some of the biggest moments that happen over the course of the series. So again, to be clear, if you have not seen the Jinx and don't want it spoiled for you, I would click off the video now and just go watch it. Don't worry, I won't take it personal. So in addition to conducting hours of interviews with Mr. Durst, Andrew and his team also spoke with many of the key figures involved in these different cases. But the man himself was always the anchor of the narrative. The interviews with Durst are played periodically throughout the series from episode 2 onwards, to give greater context to what is being discussed within each episode. And something very interesting happens as the series unfolds. It starts off small, with Robert giving explanations for things that Andrew clearly finds suspicious, but that dark cloud over Mr. Durst's head seems to grow more and more over the course of the series. The most dramatic revelation of all, however, comes during the crew's interview with Sareb Kaufman. Initially, Sareb is a staunch defender of Robert Durst, maintaining his belief there was no chance that he would hurt Susan Berman. Even when the clear motive Robert had to kill her is laid out to him, he refuses to believe it's possible. The interview team leaves and moves on to other people involved in the story, when a few weeks later they get a call from Mr. Kaufman. His curiosity triggered by the discussion he had with Andrew, he decided to look through some old boxes he had of Miss Berman's belongings, and what he found would shock the production team, as well as blow the investigation into Susan Berman's death wide open. Inside Susan's possessions, Sareb finds a letter that was sent to her by Robert Durst a few months prior to her death. A simple white envelope with block lettering, and the word Beverly misspelled. The resemblance to the cadaver letter is striking. Sareb hands the note over to the show's producers and is clearly emotional about what is going on. This is a man he trusted, loved, and admired. Someone who'd been a friend to him and the woman he thought of as a mother. The producers take this letter and immediately make a copy of it, storing the original in a safety deposit box, which they later hand over to the Beverly Hills Police Department. They then begin the grueling process of trying to schedule a new interview with Robert Durst, under the guise that they have just a few more questions they need him to answer for the series, when in reality their goal is to confront him on camera with the letter they found. This is a process that is drawn out for several months, as Robert, who has possibly become aware Andrew is looking at him more suspiciously now, cancels and reschedules on the crew repeatedly. Finally, after months and months of playing cat and mouse, Robert meets with Andrew one more time, and during the interview, the letter is presented to him. What happens next is fascinating, because it's one of the few times during his appearances on the Jinx that Robert doesn't look like he's in control of the situation. Initially, he tries to write the similarities off as no big deal, saying that it's just block lettering and that a lot of people write their letters that way. He admits to writing the letter that had been sent to Susan months before, but maintains he didn't write the cadaver letter that was sent to police. But when both letters are held up side by side and Robert is asked to pick out which one is the one he'd written, he isn't able to. Mr. Durst then becomes very uncomfortable and squirms around in his chair, doing this awkward burping between each word he says. Eventually, he excuses himself to the bathroom, where he begins talking, not realizing his mic is still on, and says the following: "There it is, you're caught. You're right, of course, but you can't imagine. Arrest him. I don't know what's in the house. Oh, I want this. What a disaster. He was right, I was wrong. And the burping, I'm having difficulty with the question. What the hell did I do? Killed them all, of course." This is the final scene of the Jinx, and is considered, for obvious reasons, its most profound and stunning moment. But in the interest of fairness, it is worth pointing out this isn't what Robert Durst said verbatim. In a move that I feel was a huge mistake on the part of the filmmakers, they decided to rearrange Robert's words so that "killed them all, of course" was at the end. The actual quote is, "I don't know what you expected to get. I don't know what's in the house. Oh, I want this. killed them all, of course. I want to do something new. There's nothing new about that. He was right, I was wrong. The burping. I'm having difficulty with the question. What the hell did I do? Now, I understand as much as anyone wanting to arrange your audio in a way that makes things more dramatic. But this sort of tactic can really hurt your credibility with an audience. And frankly, it's not like the actual quote looks much better for Robert. So I'm not even sure why they felt the need to do this. The Jinx would release in 2015 and was an award-winning smash hit, marking a career-defining achievement for its filmmaker and a renewed public scrutiny of the man that was the subject of the series. For all of the on-screen drama, however, just as much if not more drama was taking place off-screen. This entire time, police in both Beverly Hills and New York City were still working to find leads into Susan Berman and Kathy Durst's cases. So when the crew for the Jinx contacted the Beverly Hills Police Department and told them about the letter Sarah Kaufman had given them, they were understandably very interested. This evidence helped give the investigation some newfound momentum, and police flew out to New York several times while the Jinx was in post-production to interview people who'd been close to Robert at the time of Susan's murder. These interviews provided officers with more evidence and eventually led to murder charges being filed against Robert Durst. He was tracked to a hotel in New Orleans and arrested by the FBI in March of 2015, just days before the dramatic finale of The Jinx was set to air on HBO. He was extradited to California, where he was set to be charged with first-degree murder. But as all things involving Robert Durst, there was some substantial delays. For starters, he was in very poor health by this point. The years between his interviews with Andrew and his arrest had not been kind to him. Mr. Durst had a tumor in his esophagus that had been removed, a shunt that had been placed in his brain due to hydrocephalus, and a cervical spinal fusion. As a result of this, the preliminary hearings for Susan Berman's murder trial didn't even begin until 2 years after Durst was arrested. These pre-trial hearings then went on for another 2 years as Robert's lawyers, including his old friend Dick DeGarian, argued back and forth with the prosecution over what evidence was admissible and several other procedural issues they had with the state of California's case. I don't want to get into the weeds on this stuff too much right now because we plan to cover the trial and subsequent result, whatever it may be, in a later episode, and this video has gone on for longer than I ever imagined it would at this point. After this extensive series of delays, the trial was set to start in March of 2020, just in time for another delay due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Finally, over a year later, in May of 2021, the trial began, and like everything involving Robert Durst, it has been filled with a level of drama that is stranger than fiction. As I said, we will cover everything involving the trial in a later episode once it has been resolved. But if you can't wait for that and want to see a rundown of everything as it's happening, the channel Law and Crime Network has been live streaming each day of the trial on YouTube. So I'll be sure to leave a link in the description for those of you who want to see what is happening in real time. The question now on everyone's mind is, will Robert Durst finally face justice, or will his almost supernatural string of luck continue? For now, we have come to the end of this video and the end of our coverage on Robert Durst until a verdict is finally brought down. If you've made it this far, I want to thank all of you immensely. This was an exhaustive project that easily required the most amount of time out of any video I've ever done on this channel. Even with that, the sad truth is I couldn't cover every bit of information in this story because there is just so damn much of it. As a reminder, there is always a comment pinned under these videos with extra information and any corrections that we may have. So scroll down and check it out if you're curious. If you like the channel and want to help support what we do, feel free to sign up for our Patreon like these lovely people have. You'll receive early access to our videos as well as behind the scenes updates on the future plans for the channel. There is a link available in the description below and on our channel page if that's something you are interested in. And as always, if you are interested in true crime, criminal justice history, or mysterious stories from around the world, consider subscribing and hitting that notification bell so you can be updated whenever we post something new. This is Crime Spot, and thank you for watching.